Captain Grant sat in the command chair of the TCS Valiant, a warship that was modern but not impressive by galactic standards. The bridge was quiet. The crew moved with the calm efficiency of soldiers who had trained together for years. Outside the viewport, the darkness of space stretched endlessly, broken only by distant stars. The Valiant was approaching Nexus Prime, a neutral station where old empires and young species met to talk about treaties and territory. Grant was a man in his late 40s with a face and gray eyes that saw too much. He had fought in wars that most people in the galaxy would never hear about. He had seen colonies destroyed. He had seen good soldiers die for bad reasons. Now he was sailing towards something that made the older captains nervous, that had called for help. Though an ancient empire that had ruled their corner of space for thousands of years had asked humanity for military aid. The communication officer, Ensign Hayes, looked up from his station. "Captain, we are receiving a priority message from the Galactic Council. They want confirmation that you received the briefing documents." Grant nodded slowly. He had read the documents. Everyone had. The Empire controlled vast territories. They had technology that humanity still did not fully understand. They had military power that made human navies look like fishing boats. But they were dying. Something was eating through their space like a plague, consuming worlds and ships and entire populations. The thing that was killing, though, was called the Swarm. No one knew where they came from originally. Some said they were created by a dead civilization as weapons. Others said they were natural predators that had evolved for millions of years. What mattered was that they were hungry. They were organized. They were unstoppable. They had fought them for 2 years. They had lost 17 worlds. They had lost hundreds of warships. Their military commanders had tried every strategy in the ancient books of war and nothing worked. They adapted. They learned. They kept coming. So they had made a choice. They had reached out to humanity, not because they respected humanity, not because they thought humans were strong. They had reached out to humanity because they were desperate, and desperation makes even proud empires bend. Grant stood from his chair and walked to the viewport. The station was visible now, a massive structure rotating slowly against the black. Ships of 100 different species orbited around it, destroyers, mining vessels, the sleek cruisers of the collective, and scattered among them a handful of human ships. The Valiant was not the biggest or the most powerful, but it was here. That was what mattered. Lieutenant Sarah Palmer, the tactical officer, approached the captain. She was young, maybe 35, with dark hair pulled back tight. She had a reputation for thinking fast when things started to break apart. "Captain, I have been looking at the movement patterns from the last survey ships," Palmer said. She held a data pad in her hand. "The swarm is moving in predictable directions. It is heading toward the core worlds." "How long?" Grant asked. 3 weeks, maybe less," Palmer said. "The defenses on those worlds are already damaged from previous attacks. If they hit them now, the civilization loses its center. They lose everything." Grant had known this. Everyone knew it. But hearing it from Palmer made it real, made it a problem that his Navy might have to solve. Chief Engineer came onto the bridge. He was an older man with thick hands and a direct way of speaking. "Captain, the ship is ready for whatever you need. Weapons are armed. Shields are at full capacity. Engines can push to maximum if needed." Grant thanked him. He looked around the bridge at his crew. These were good people. These were people who trusted him. They were also people who were about to walk into a war that was not humanity's war. The Galactic Council had authorized the Valiant to investigate and assess. They had not authorized anything else. But Grant had been in the military long enough to know that authorization and reality did not always match. The communication system came alive. A voice, strange and formal, came through the speakers. It was a high-ranking voice. It was the voice of someone who did not usually have to ask anyone for anything. "Terran vessel Valiant, this is High Chancellor Vex of the Collective. I request immediate meeting with your commander. The situation has changed. They are moving faster than our calculations suggested. We need to speak with you now." Grant felt something shift in the air. Palmer straightened, stepped closer. Even Hayes stopped typing on his console. "Send a response," Grant said calmly. "Tell the High Chancellor that Captain Grant will come to the station within the hour." As soon as Grant spoke the words, he knew that his life had just changed. He knew that the Valiant was about to sail into waters that no human warship had sailed into before. He knew that his crew might die. He knew that he might die. But he also knew something else. He knew that the galaxy had a way of testing people, of showing them what they were really made of. And he knew that humanity had spent so long trying to prove itself to the older species that people had almost forgotten why they should be proven. Humans were good at more than just surviving. Humans were good at fighting when fighting was the only thing left. Grant moved toward the bridge exit, then paused. He looked back at Palmer. "Sarah, put the ship on high alert. I want weapons charged and shields ready for anything. Do not be obvious about it, but I want every system prepared. Do not call in the middle of a battle unless something fundamental has broken." Palmer nodded. She understood what Grant was saying without him having to say it directly. They were about to ask humans to do something that would change everything. They were about to ask humans to stop running and start fighting. Grant left the bridge and made his way to the shuttle bay. He would meet with the High Chancellor. He would listen to what they needed. And then he would make a choice that would define what humanity meant in this part of the galaxy. The choice between staying safe and fighting for people who had never treated humanity as equals. The choice between saying no and saying yes. The choice between being small and being brave. The command station was built for beings who thought in terms of mathematics and perfect logic. Everything was precise. Everything had its place. The walls were a cold gray metal. The lights were bright and constant. The air smelled like recycled atmosphere mixed with something Grant could not identify. Something that reminded him of a hospital, where things were kept very clean and very dead. High Chancellor Vex stood at the center of a war room that showed the galaxy in holographic projection. There were tall beings, almost 8 feet in height, with skin that looked like polished stone. They had 4 arms. Their faces were hard to read because their eyes were large and black and did not show emotion the way human eyes did. Vex was older than most that Grant had seen. The stone of his skin had cracks in it, like ancient ceramic. "Captain Grant," Vex said. His voice was calm, but Grant heard something underneath the calm. Fear. "Thank you for coming so quickly. I need to show you something." Vex gestured with one of his upper arms. The holograph zoomed in on a section of space. What Grant saw made his blood run cold. 17 worlds were marked in red. They were dead. They were gone. But that was not what made Grant feel the cold in his chest. What made him feel it was the swarm. The swarm was visible as a moving cloud, a thing that consumed light and made space around it bend wrong. It was moving through territory like a mouth eating through food. 3 weeks ago the fleet was here, Vex said, pointing to a location closer to the outer territories. Today they are here. They are accelerating. Something has changed in their behavior. They are not moving in the patterns we predicted. They are moving faster, moving more directly. General stepped forward. He was younger than Vex, maybe 500 years old based on the smooth surface of his skin. They lived very long lives. They had time to remember everything that had gone wrong in their history. "We have thrown everything we have at them, our best weapons, our most advanced ships. Nothing works. They do not follow logical patterns. They do not respond to military theory. They simply attack and consume and move on to the next target." Grant studied the hologram. He was not looking at what they were showing him. He was looking at how they moved. He was looking for rhythm, for weakness, for the thing that every living thing had, which was predictability hidden under the appearance of chaos. "How do your ships behave under extreme G-force?" Grant asked suddenly. They stopped talking. Vex and exchanged a look that meant something, though Grant could not read what it meant exactly. "Our ships are not designed for such stress," said. Our combat doctrine relies on precision firing and calculated responses. G-forces above normal operating parameters cause damage. Grant nodded slowly. That was the problem. That was what he had suspected. They fought like accountants. They calculated every variable before moving. They planned 3 moves ahead because they had the computing power to do so. Though on the other hand did not calculate. They did not plan. They simply reacted. They evolved. They learned. They adapted faster than they could calculate new solutions. "Show me the ships," Grant said. "Show me how they are constructed." Vex brought up new images. The vessels were not built. They were grown. They were biological things, massive creatures that had been shaped over millions of years into ships. They had organic armor that could regenerate. They had weapons that grew from their bodies. They had engines that pulsed with a rhythm like a heartbeat. "They are alive," Grant said. "Yes," said. "This is why we cannot destroy them. Every time we develop a weapon that damages them, they evolve a defense against that weapon. The swarm learns. The swarm adapts. The swarm cannot be beaten by logic because the swarm does not think in logic. It thinks in survival." Grant turned away from the hologram. He looked at their hard faces and their large eyes and their 4 arms hanging at their sides. These beings had ruled space for thousands of years. They had built civilizations that spanned star systems. They had knowledge that humanity would take centuries to understand, but they did not know how to fight something that did not follow the rules of calculation. "You need humans," Grant said simply. "Not because humans are stronger, not because humans have better technology. Humans need to be part of this because humans know how to fight things that do not make sense. Humans know how to break rules and still win. Humans know how to be chaotic and still survive." "Can you defeat the?" Vex asked. The question was direct. There was no hope in it. It was a question asked by someone who had already accepted that hope was probably dead. Grant thought about his crew. He thought about the Valiant and its weapons and its shields. He thought about how many there were, and how the swarm seemed to stretch across light years of space like a cancer eating through a body. "I do not know," Grant said, "but I know that your way of fighting them will not work. I know that your logic cannot beat their hunger. I know that you need something that operates on a different level. You need speed. You need people who will take risks that your calculators say are too dangerous. You need warriors who will do the thing that makes no sense and find that it works anyway." General made a sound, something like a cough, but Grant thought it might have been laughter. "The Galactic Council will not authorize a full military operation. Humanity is new. The other species fear what humanity might become if given too much power too quickly." "Then we do not tell them," Grant said. "We tell them we are investigating. We tell them we are assessing the threat. Then we get on our ships and we sail into that swarm and we figure out how to kill it." Vex looked at Grant for a long moment. When they spoke, his voice was quiet. "If you do this, you might die. Your ship might be destroyed. Your crew might all be killed. And the galaxy might blame humanity for interfering in a war that was not ours to fight." "If I do not do this," Grant said, "then they will keep eating through space until there is nothing left. Then they will move on to other civilizations. Then they will reach human space. And humans will have to fight them anyway, but we will have fewer allies and more enemies who think we should have helped when we had the chance." Grant extended his hand, the way humans did when making an agreement. They did not shake hands. They did not have that custom. But Vex reached out with one of his upper hands and gripped Grant's arm. It was an old gesture, old enough that even the ancient remembered it meant something serious was happening. "Then we will fight together," Vex said. "Humans and together. Perhaps you are right, Captain. Perhaps what the galaxy needs is not more calculation. Perhaps it needs more courage." TCS Valiant moved into combat position with weapons hot and shields raised to full strength. Around the ship, destroyers and battle cruisers moved in formation. The human vessel was small compared to the warships, but Grant had made sure that his crew was ready for anything. The swarm filled the space ahead of them like a living wall of darkness. Major Collins stood in the hangar bay of the Valiant with his Marine unit. The Marines were suited up in combat armor, heavy and functional. They carried rifles that fired kinetic rounds and energy weapons that could cut through most standard armor. Collins was a thick man with a shaved head and the kind of face that did not show fear because fear had been trained out of him years ago. He looked at his soldiers, and he felt something that commanders always felt before a battle. It was not hope. It was not confidence. It was the knowledge that some of these people would not come back alive. "Listen up," Collins said, his voice carrying through the hangar. "We are about to hit something that has never seen humans fight before. We are going to show them what we do when we have to. No hesitation, no retreat. We move fast, we hit hard, and we adapt to whatever they throw at us. To think in plans, we think in problems and solutions. We see something that does not work, we change it. That is our advantage. That is the only advantage we have." The Marines listened. They nodded. They understood what was being asked of them because they had trained for it. In the command center of the Valiant, Lieutenant Palmer was running the tactical systems. Data was coming in from the sensors and from human probes. The ships were moving in patterns that were almost random but not quite. There was rhythm hidden in the chaos. Palmer had been studying it for hours. She was starting to see it now. "Captain," Palmer said over the communication system, "I think I found something. The ships are using a biological signal network. They are not transmitting in any frequency we use, but they are communicating through a frequency that appears to be organic, like a nerve impulse across a massive organism." Grant was in the captain's chair. He leaned forward. "Can we disrupt it?" "If we overload our communications arrays and broadcast across multiple frequencies simultaneously, we might be able to create enough noise to interfere with their signal chain," Palmer said. "But it will be a temporary effect, maybe 10 minutes at best before they adapt to the interference." "10 minutes is enough," Grant said. He looked at, "I need everything the engines have, maximum acceleration on my signal." Nodded from his station. His hands were already moving across the controls, preparing the massive power cores that drove the Valiant through space. They came first. They came in waves, smaller creatures that looked like they were part ship and part organism. They hit the defensive lines like a storm. The ships fired their weapons with precision. One shot, one kill. That was the way, but they kept coming. For every one that died, 3 more took its place. The TCS Valiant moved into the secondary line of combat. Grant watched the sensor readouts as his ship engaged fighters. The human approach was different from the approach. Where the calculated, humans improvised. The Valiant did not wait for perfect targeting solutions. It fired at targets that had a probability of being hit, then moved. The movement itself was a weapon. Collins led his Marines onto a damaged cruiser that had been separated from the main swarm. The creature was still alive, still fighting. The Marines moved through its corridors, which were wet and organic and wrong in every way that human soldiers had been trained to expect. They found chambers where the crew lived, if living was the right word for it. The creatures were not entirely biological. They were not entirely mechanical. They were something between. Something that had been evolved and engineered across millions of years into the perfect predator. Collins ordered his soldiers to plant charges in the core structure. They did it without hesitation. They did it knowing that the ship was dying and they might not escape before it died with them. But they did it anyway because that was what soldiers did when soldiers knew what needed to be done. Grant watched the tactical display as his ship took damage. Weapons cut through the outer hull. Debris spun away from the Valiant into the black, but the shields held, was pushing the engines to the absolute limit. The ship was making maneuvers that human civilians would have found impossible to survive. The G-forces would have crushed softer bodies, but these were military personnel. These were people who had trained for violence and endurance. Palmer activated the signal jamming. Across the communication arrays, human frequency transmitters blasted noise in every direction. The effect was immediate. The swarm became disorganized. Ships that had been moving in perfect coordination suddenly seemed confused. They started firing at targets that were not there. They stopped responding to what appeared to be biological commands. It was in this moment of chaos that Grant made his decision. In this moment when they were confused and separated, he ordered the Valiant to accelerate directly into the center of the formation. The ship moved like a spear, cutting through the swarm. Palmer fired weapons in automatic patterns. Every system was pushed to maximum. The ship shook. The crew held on to their stations, but the Valiant kept moving forward. They saw what Grant was doing. Understanding came to them in that moment. The human captain was not trying to win. The human captain was trying to create an opening. The generals, watching from their command ships, realized that humans did not think about victory the way ancient empires did. Humans thought about the next step, then the step after that. Collins and his Marines blew charges in the cruiser. The creature exploded in a burst of biological matter and energy. Collins himself was hit by the shockwave. He fell through a corridor, smoke and fire around him. But he moved. He ran. His soldiers grabbed him and they ran together because staying meant death and moving meant maybe death, which was better odds. The Valiant emerged from the formation smoking and damaged but intact. Grant looked at his crew. Palmer had blood on her face from a cut that happened when her station exploded, was gripping the edge of his console. Hayes was still transmitting, still sending data. "Damage report," Grant said. "Hull breaches on decks 3 and 5, reported. "We lost power to secondary weapons. The engines can give us maybe 30 more minutes before they start failing. But Captain, we hurt them. We hurt them badly." Palmer was looking at the tactical display. The formation is fragmenting. They are not moving as a unified swarm anymore. Grant understood what this meant. They were not invincible. They were adapted and ancient and powerful. But they could be hurt. They could be confused. They could be beaten if someone was willing to hurt badly enough to break them. "Prepare the ships to push forward," Grant ordered. "We are not done yet. We are going to keep hitting them until we can hit the thing that controls them all." Around the Valiant, the warships moved into attack positions. They had seen what the humans could do. They had understood, finally, that calculation alone was not enough. That sometimes survival meant moving into danger without knowing exactly where it would lead. The Hive Mother's flagship was old. It was massive. It was a creature that had been alive for thousands of years, consuming civilizations and growing stronger from their extinction. The ship was called the Consuming Will by the few that had ever seen it and survived to speak. It was easily 3 times the size of the largest destroyer. Its armor was thick with the bones of 1,000 consumed species. Its weapons extended like tentacles from its massive body. Grant stood on the bridge of the Valiant and looked at the target. Palmer had updated her tactical display. The Consuming Will was surrounded by defensive swarms. If the Valiant approached directly, it would take 30 minutes to fight through the enemy forces. That was 30 minutes the Valiant did not have. The engines were overheating. The hull was compromised. The ship was dying slowly. But 30 minutes was not what Grant was planning for. "Set course directly for the Hive Mother," Grant said calmly. "Maximum acceleration. I do not care about the defensive swarms. I do not care about the probability calculations. You are going to take this ship through them." Looked up from his station. He understood what Grant was saying. He understood what it meant. The TCS Valiant was not going to survive what was about to happen. "Yes," Captain said. His voice was steady. Palmer began firing weapons in front of the ship, clearing a path. The defensive forces did not know what they were facing. They were used to fighting warships that moved with precision and calculation. They were not used to a ship that simply accelerated forward without regard for its own survival. The Valiant cut through the first defensive line like a blade. Ships that had been for millions of years were crushed against the human vessel. The adapted, trying new tactics, but the Valiant was already past them. Collins was in the hold of the Hive Mother's ship. He did not know how he had gotten there. The boarding operation had been chaos. His Marines had fired weapons and moved through corridors that were alive and breathing. They had faced creatures that bled and creatures that did not bleed but still died when enough damage was done to them. Now Collins and 12 surviving Marines stood in the central chamber of the consuming will. The chamber was massive. The walls were organic matter that pulsed with something that might have been life. In the center of the chamber was the Queen, the mother creature that controlled the entire swarm through some form of biological networking that human science did not have names for. The Queen was ancient. The Queen was wrong in every way that a living creature should be right. It had parts that did not match. It had eyes that looked like weapons. It had mouths that opened where mouths should not be able to open. It was the most horrible thing that Collins had ever seen, and he had seen things in his military career that had made him question if the universe had any mercy at all. "Plant the charges," Collins ordered. "Move fast, we do not have much time." His Marines moved. They set explosive charges in the biological structure around the Queen. The charges were designed to destroy systems, to sever connections, to kill things that were alive. They would work as well on this creature as they worked on anything else. The consuming will shook. The Hive Mother had felt the Valiant's attack. The ship's weapons fired at the human vessel. One of the blasts hit the Valiant directly. It tore through the armor like it was paper, felt the impact. He felt the ship dying. "All hands, this is the captain," Grant said over the communication system. His voice was calm and steady. "This is the moment. This is what we have trained for. This is what we came here to do. I am ordering all non-essential personnel to the escape pods. Everyone else, stay at your stations. We are going to hit the Hive Mother with everything we have, and then we are going to hit her with ourselves." Palmer understood what Grant was saying. She had known for the last hour that this was where the mission ended. She had accepted it. She had made peace with it. But hearing Grant say it made it real, made it the thing that was actually happening instead of the thing that might happen. "All weapons charged," Palmer said. Her voice was steady. She was going to stay at her station. The captain would go down with his ship, and she would make sure the ship went down, taking as much of the with her as possible. Grant reached over and gripped Palmer's shoulder. "Make it count, Sarah. Make every shot count." The Valiant accelerated one more time. The engines gave everything they had. The ship moved forward into the space that was reserved for ships to die. Ahead, the consuming will filled the viewport. Behind the ship, the fleet moved in support, throwing everything they had at the defensive forces. Collins and his Marines ran. The charges were set. The Queen was still moving, still trying to kill the creatures that had invaded her body. But the explosives were detonating now. The chain reaction was starting. "Get out," Collins screamed to his soldiers. "Move to the evacuation point." The Valiant hit the consuming will. The impact was terrible and perfect. The ship that had carried human warriors across the galaxy penetrated the armor of the creature that had consumed thousands of civilizations. Inside the Hive Mother, the explosives that Collins had planted began to destroy the biological core that controlled the entire swarm. Grant was in his captain's chair. The impact threw him forward. The bridge was filling with smoke, but Grant did not move. Grant did not run. Grant did something that they would have found illogical and incomprehensible. Grant made a choice. "All crew, this is Captain Grant," he said into the communication system. His voice was clear and strong even as his ship was dying around him. "I am proud to have served with every one of you. I am proud to have been your captain, and I am proud to die doing what warriors do. We protect people. We protect the innocent. And sometimes we protect even the people who do not think we are worth protecting. This is what it means to be human. Remember this. Remember that we chose this. Remember that we did not hide. Remember that we fought." The consuming will came apart. The biological systems that had been consuming the galaxy for thousands of years failed. The creature that was both ship and organism and weapon experienced something it had never experienced before. It experienced dying at the hands of beings that should not have been able to kill it. Collins watched the explosion from the evacuation shuttle. He watched the TCS Valiant, and the consuming will merge into a single blast of light and fire and energy. He thought of Captain Grant. He thought of the choice that Grant had made. He thought of what it meant to be the kind of soldier that would die so that others might live. Around the explosion, the swarm began to break apart. The loss of the hive mother was like the death of a central nervous system. The creatures that had been organized and unified suddenly became confused. They started attacking each other. They started moving in random directions. The extinction wave that had been consuming the galaxy had been broken. The forces pressed forward, destroying the scattered ships. General watched from his command vessel as the battle turned, as the tide changed, as the impossible became possible. And millions of light years away on Earth, humans were still going about their lives, not knowing that their captain had just died to save a civilization that had never respected them, not knowing that humanity had stepped into the arena and had proven something that the galaxy had not expected, not knowing that the age of small and insignificant had ended, and the age of human power had begun. 3 months had passed since the death of the consuming will. The swarm was broken. Individual creatures still existed, scattered across space like pieces of a shattered mirror, but they were no longer unified. They were no longer an apocalypse. The extinction wave had been stopped. Captain Sarah Palmer stood on the bridge of the TCS Grant, a new warship named in honor of the man who had given everything to save a civilization that had not believed in him. The ship was newer than the Valiant had been. It was faster. It was stronger. But Palmer missed the old ship sometimes. She missed the crew that had served on her. She missed Captain Grant most of all, though she tried not to let that show on her face while she was doing her job. The fleet was in formation around the human vessels. General stood in a diplomatic chamber aboard Palmer's ship. With him were 3 scientists. They had come to discuss something that Palmer found strange, something that challenged everything they believed about what could be done with the. "You understand," said, "that many in the council believe the surviving creatures should be destroyed. They argue that any living is a potential threat, that we have learned our lesson and should not take chances." Palmer nodded. She understood the argument. She had heard it from the leadership and from some of the human commanders as well. The safest thing would be to hunt down every surviving and end it. But that was not what Major Collins had suggested when he returned from the Hive Mother's flagship. "What does the research show?" Palmer asked. One of the scientists, a female named, stepped forward. When the Hive Mother was destroyed, the neural network that connected all was severed. The individual creatures that survived are no longer receiving commands. They are no longer unified. More importantly, they are beginning to develop individual consciousness, separate from the hive, separate from the network that controlled them. Palmer leaned forward. "Are you saying they might be capable of reasoning, of choice?" "Possibly," said. "They were not always this way. In their original evolutionary state, they may have had individual agency. The hive structure was imposed over millions of years, but now that the hive is broken, they may be returning to something more like their original nature. They may be capable of being something other than weapons." The chamber was silent. The implications of what was saying were enormous. They were not mindless tools. They might be thinking beings who had been enslaved by their own biology. They might be prisoners in their own bodies. Palmer thought of what Captain Grant had said before he died. She thought of his message about protecting people, even the people who did not think they deserved protection. She thought about what it meant to see an enemy and realize it was not really an enemy. It was something that had been made into an enemy by circumstance and biology. "Begin the research," Palmer ordered. "We will establish a research facility. We will study the surviving. We will determine if they can be given what they have never had. We will give them a choice." General made a sound that might have been disagreement, But he did not protest. They had learned something in the last 3 months. They had learned that humans did not think like them. Humans did not calculate. Humans did something stranger. Humans hoped. Humans believed that things could be better than they seemed. Humans were willing to take risks on that belief. The research facility was built on a station in neutral space, far from both and human territory. Major Collins was assigned to oversee the operation. He had experienced the up-close. He had fought them. He had killed them. Now he was being asked to help them become something other than killers. It was a strange assignment for a soldier, but Collins was good at adapting to the impossible. The first they worked with was named Keeper, though that was not the creature's original name. They did not have names the way humans did, but Keeper seemed to understand that the designation meant something. Keeper was younger than most of the other surviving creatures. Keeper was developing consciousness faster than expected. Collins sat across from Keeper in an observation chamber. The space between them was reinforced glass. Keeper was contained, though the containment was meant to be temporary. Collins had requested that humans be the first to show Keeper that other beings in the universe might not be threats. "You understand me?" Collins asked. Keeper made a sound. It was not a word in any human language, but Collins had learned to recognize it as communication. Communication that was not coming from a central hive consciousness, but from an individual creature making an individual choice about what to say. "You were made to kill," Collins said. "You were made to be part of something larger than yourself. That thing is gone now. You are alone for the first time in your existence. You can be something else. You can choose what you will be." Keeper moved. The movement was curious, not aggressive. The creature seemed to be examining the space around it, examining Collins, examining the concept of choice. "This is what humans do," Collins continued. "We do not ask permission to exist. We do not ask for allowance to make choices. We choose. We fail. We try again. We are not very good at following orders, but we are very good at being alive." Days passed. Weeks passed. Keeper's consciousness developed. Keeper began to understand that other beings were not simply targets or food sources. Keeper began to understand that there were other ways to exist in the galaxy besides consumption and destruction. 6 months after Keeper's awakening, the Terran leadership met to make a decision. The question was simple: what do we do with the surviving? Chancellor Vex stood in front of the full gathering. "The humans have suggested something unprecedented. They suggest that we give the surviving the opportunity to choose, to join us in building something rather than destroying it. The Council has voted. We will agree to this experiment, but it must be carefully monitored. It must be controlled." Palmer stood and addressed the gathering. Captain Grant died believing that even the greatest threats could be met with courage and compassion. He believed that strength was not just about how many weapons you had. It was about how much you were willing to risk for what was right. They are victims of their own biology. They deserve a chance to be something else. Over the following year, Keeper and 3 other creatures went through a transformation. Not biological, but psychological and social. They learned to speak human languages. They learned to read. They learned to understand the universe in ways they had never been allowed to understand it before. They began to contribute to research. They began to think about the future instead of existing only for the present moment. Keeper became the representative of the people to the joint human government. It was a controversial appointment. Many in both civilizations opposed it, but Palmer had pushed for it. Collins had supported it, and gradually the opposition became quieter. Years later, when historians looked back at this time, they would call it the moment humanity changed the galaxy. Not through weapons, not through superior technology, not through political maneuvering, but through the decision to see an enemy and choose to believe that enemies could become something else, that enemies could become allies, that enemies could even become friends. Palmer stood on the bridge of the TCS Grant, looking out at a space that was no longer defined by extinction and terror. a space that was becoming defined by cooperation and possibility. She thought of Captain Grant. She thought of his final words. "We do not fight to conquer. We fight so that others might live. And sometimes we fight so that even our enemies might become something more." The TCS Grant moved forward into deep space, toward tomorrow, toward a future that would not have existed if one captain had not been willing to die so that his people might live. History moves in the choices of individuals. In this case, the choice had been made by a man who understood that true strength meant knowing when to fight and knowing when to offer mercy instead.